Starting in 3, 2, 1. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Explicit Ventures Podcast with Tommy, Seth, and Mike. We're ready to go. We got the gang's all back. I was just talking with Seth. I was like, man, it feels like a long week. I woke up this morning like, is it Friday yet? Nope, not quite yet. I thought it was Friday yesterday. So that was how my week's going.
It's nice getting your headspace where it belongs after, an extended break, only 4 days in to go back to the same headspace you were in before.
Yes.
No.
So I have some happy news to report. I've been doing a little bit of testing. I have been, in the past, I've been very vocal about how much I did not like the deployment pipelines in Power BI Premium. I have to kind of walk back on that a little bit now and say, deployment pipelines are great. I really like them now. There's a lot of things that have been resolved. They seem to be working as expected for me right now. I haven't done full extensive testing on them, but in my initial runs, it looks pretty solid. So so let me paint you guys a picture real quick. I think we've talked about this before, but I want to just paint a picture here for the audience, just to kind of make sure that we understand. Like, here's a scenario that I've had problems with. We have a data model. The data model is quite large, and it takes quite a while for it to load things from the back-end services, right? You've got months of data where there's 5-6 million records per month, right? So you have a lot of records per month, and what we're looking at is when you load that data model, or when you make a change to the PBAX file and publish to the PowerBI.com service, it becomes quite time-consuming, right? To say the least, I guess. You can't just hit refresh on the model and let it go. Something will time out. PowerBI.com will time out in 2 hours. If you go from SSMS, it will time out in 5 hours. So you need something faster to load all that data. So what you turn on is incremental refresh. Well, great. You can push the model up. You can make all the partitions, and then you can incrementally refresh portions of those partitions with SSMS, other tooling, external tools. Great. And this is again only on premium. The challenge becomes you don't want to take down your production model for a long period of time, especially if you're making changes to it. So you need this area where you can like stage the changes and then quickly swap over to the main model. So I found a technique that seems to be working for me right now, where you take a data model, you put it in a deployment pipeline. In the deployment pipeline, you load everything into the test environment, the reports, the model, everything that you need, refresh the model there, and you can do that slowly over time throughout the workday. And then what you can do, you hook up the Azure Blob Storage connection to workspaces. And so what will happen is when you do this, it allows you to do two things. If you have data flows, it will capture the data flow details, I think, or the data flow CSV files that come out of the data flows. And then on the in the blob storage portion, it makes a folder called Power BI Backups. And so what this allows you to do is you can go into the XMLA endpoint, right-click on the data model, and say backup. And what it will do is it'll make an ABF file. That ABF file is then immediately backed up, and all the partitions, all the data inside it, it's compressed in its compressed form. It'll just save it really quick. So I was able to go out there, save my backup file of the model. Then procedurally, I went back to deployment pipelines, updated my model from test to prod, and then was able to go back into the backend and restore from backup. So you can actually move those ABF files around. So I moved it from the folder for test in the to the folder that was for prod, overwrote the prod backup, and then restored from backup from the prod environment. Super fast. It worked in like a couple minutes to reload all the data, and everything was up to speed. So
Isn't this
pretty slick?
So a couple things in here. Did you mention Management Studio? Because that's where you're doing your backup and restore, right?
Yep. Everything, you can't do the desktop, and PowerBI.com does not give you the option to do backup. Right. It has to be in SQL Server Management Studio.
Do I need deployment pipelines, or are you just describing?
I like the idea of
restore.
Well, so I was describing backup restore. I don't think you need the deployment pipelines to do that. I did like the separation of the different data models. So my data model is the same model, named the same in both environments. So I can do all my work in the test environment, I like that kind of as a general principle because I've got other reports we're going to do. We're going to make changes to models. We're going to do lots of things for changes. The deployment pipeline tells me which files are different very easily. So it gives me a very clean, doesn't tell me what changed. It just tells me that it did change. It would be up to me to figure out what changed.
Were you just testing the data set itself, or were you replacing it where reports were tied to the data set in the workspace?
Model and thin report. So that was the other part that I really liked about this too is
so replacing or restoring that model of the same name by SSMS into a different workspace automatically reconnected it to those reports. See, that's
was a lot.
That's good news because I still am stuck in that restore part because I got that bizarre error, but you know, we talked about that. So
we've talked about
that's
that
cool,
one.
man. That's cool.
So I'm gonna try if I can get my if this week doesn't go on forever, I'll hopefully be able to come back and do a little demo or a video of how you would execute on this on a YouTube video to kind of show backup and restore across workspaces in a deployment pipeline, which I think is going to be very helpful for people.
The other amazing thing now that you got that restore path to work, right, is I knew the backup was super fast. But your description, I think, is that the restore is also really fast.
It was pretty quick. Yeah, it was fast.
That's.
I mean, we're talking like
it's gonna be super helpful because where that is very applicable, right? Is it makes sense to get this up and running because you basically remove the not so fun part about really large models in that if you're refreshing those, that's a nightly task or a weekend task.
Yes.
Right. Whereas typically us BI folks don't like to be like, on the hook in the off hours. And this kind of pushed us in that direction where we had to because there was no other way. So I'm excited about that.
This allows you to stage a model during work hours and kind of prep it before you're done. And at the very last second, switch it over. So you could do your switch over like at 5, 6 p.m. And
what you're describing is test it too, right?
Yes.
So you'd have that in your test environment. You could validate against the test reports, and then just do a backup restore into the other workspace, and it just works.
As a random tidbit of information, I also went down a slight rabbit hole to get to this answer. The rabbit hole was what happens when you have Power BI reports syncing from OneDrive, and can you break that OneDrive connection such that you can start using deployment pipelines? The answer is no. As soon as you sync something from OneDrive, that file forever shall be linked to OneDrive, and I am not aware of anything that I have done that will allow you to break or sever that connection so you can deploy from desktop back into the service. It will not do it. And so even the deployment pipelines obey this rule or whatever it is. So if you have a production workspace and you attach a production workspace where files are being published from SharePoint or OneDrive, when you reverse deploy to test, it copies that property over with the files. You can't overwrite it for whatever reason. So I don't know. I got to do a little more testing around like what's with the SharePoint OneDrive thing, but it locks you down hard.
I was never a fan of that method. But like you're saying, like what would be? Have you tried like switching that data set and report into a large data set? Because that should sever. Because once you flip into a large data set or enable XMLA endpoint, right, you can't download it anymore. Right. So
correct data models, correct. Yeah, reports and stuff like that. Yeah, correct. Yes.
So I wonder if that would break it though, because
I'm pretty sure I was already on.
Because you're talking about a connection where you're like, I have a PBIX, I can make a modification, and then it automatically
syncs itself.
Shows up.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because previously you could just overwrite it. You would just publish from desktop, and you would overwrite that property, and it would just overwrite it and be done.
The search for how to break that connection. Yeah.
Well, I like the idea that it blocks you from desktop. So so let me explain something else here while we're kind of doing this. The desktop, right? If you have a Power BI file in desktop and you put it in OneDrive and then synchronize it there, you can then easily kind of manage like getting files to OneDrive, and then Microsoft will automatically detect that file changes and then update the contents of that file into the service, which is kind of nice. It's kind of a bit of an automated deploy. I can work on things on my desktop. Steve Campbell's Power BI version control tool with Power Apps works really well because then you could synchronize kind of, here is the production folder. This is where the data comes from for live reports. You can do all you want in checking things in and out, all the kind of other fun stuff. The downside of this now is um, you are now locked into that method, and there's no way to sever that connection from what I'm aware of. So, anyways, interesting stuff. Lots of things to think about. That
Is
would
that
have
the next user group?
which one?
Yeah.
Publishing from
All of 'em?
SharePoint or doing the backup and restore?
I think it's the whole workflow. The idea with Azure and the backup is really interesting. I know there's a few pieces of content out there, but I don't think people know the real benefits of it.
Exactly. And it's newer though, right? There's a whole bunch of, the whole partitioning thing, models are getting a lot larger. People are having to do incremental refresh. And I think that the team at Microsoft is putting a lot more features around how to manage these partitions. I think it's a
Right.
great idea. I love where they're going with this. It really makes it usable for a large cloud platform. And it helps me mitigate costs, right? When I get into Power BI Premium, I have a fixed cost. Other platforms, and again, I've been playing with Google Cloud Platform, have this varying cost. Every time you query the data set, it costs you money. So you have to really build your data set in a way. The Google Cloud Platform is very cool. It does interesting things, but it doesn't charge you by a cluster or compute. It charges you by how much data it has to touch to get you your answer, which is really interesting. It's a very different way of thinking about how to optimize your queries against data. Anyways, I digress. Good morning, guys. What's our topic for
Good
today?
morning.
It's a good lead in.
Oh man.
I thought so.
So let's completely go off
Let's go.
topic on the technical side.
Let's get rid of the technical
Man.
side. Let's talk some fluffy stuff.
Man, you can
Fluffy
tell
stuff.
that Mike is pumped about deployment pipelines.
Well, this is one of these things. If I don't document it, if I don't video it, I forget it. This is part of the reasons why I do all the blogging and the videos, and I forget what I did 6 months from now. I don't work in deployment pipelines all the time. Well, maybe I will be now, but anyways, today's
Well,
topic:
let's get into it then.
know your audiences.
So completely separate from all the configuration you have to do with deployment pipelines or the technical side. Unfortunately, most users who are viewing reports or you're helping build don't care at all about deployment pipelines.
They do when
So
they do when it breaks, and you have all your date calendars in
They
the
still don't.
wrong month.
They still don't.
all updated now. It did take a little long. It did take a little longer than I thought, but
Of
we
course.
were able to get it. But the biggest thing that we wanted to talk about today, and an idea that we had, was obviously we've talked about the process on building reports where we have the scoping, discovery,
Yep.
the feedback, and I know we've touched on this a few times, but the thing is there's a lot of wide range of spectrum of people who are going to be working with you on building that report, and the importance of really knowing who you're speaking to, from asking the questions and then what you show them, can be pivotal in terms of the success of the report. And the more I thought about this, the more I have some interesting thoughts, but
Tommy, you always have interesting thoughts.
they're just interesting.
They're
But
just thoughts. They're
it
just
was
thoughts.
there's a few philosophical, it doesn't go anywhere thoughts, but I think let's just kind of start there in terms of your experience with audience, like the different people
Yes.
that you've worked with, and what that spectrum looks like.
So let's define some of audience. In my mind, I think of two groups of people that I can think of audience. Audience being the people that I'm working with to build the reports with, or potentially the audience of the people consuming the reports, the end consumer of said reports. Which kind of audience were you thinking for, Tommy? What's in your mind? What audiences are you kind of honing in on here?
So I think there's more than three, but you could probably bucket the people that you work with into kind of three at least categories. I think there's the person who just is comfortable with data. They're coming from Excel. They just want something upgraded so they can pretty much get a better handle on what's going on with Power BI if it's their first time, but they generally know the kind of the flow. They're not overwhelmed by data. Then you have people who they have a request who come in and they don't know how anything works in Power BI, but they're in a sense still more comfortable with data. And I think the last one that I think we don't realize until it's too late is people that as soon as you start talking about metrics and logic and business rules, there's an absolute overwhelmness by that person where they check out. And those are the hardest people to, again, start building a report. And again, all of these, you kind of don't know the person's tendencies until you start working with them.
Yep.
But I think there are some telltale signs. But yeah, I mean, what what have you guys seen?
I think those audiences describe it fairly well. We have an Excel user, which I would call it from the business team. I think I agree with that one a lot. Um, I would there's another group. Maybe it's a separate group. I don't know, Seth. Maybe you'd throw these people in the same group. There's like a SQL level group, because I think when I talk about people or audiences that I build reports with or for or around, Excel users are more used to looking at the individual cells of visuals, individual cells of information. And then there's a SQL user who's more interested in like, well, what's the view doing? So I think maybe I would bucket those two people together. They're comfortable with data. What do you think, Seth?
I'm gonna. I think we're touching on. I'm gonna wrap my head around the full suite here. I think we're touching on different pieces.
Yeah.
I like your initial high levels, Mike. You've kind of co-workers
Yep.
or consumers, more consumers of reports.
Yeah.
I think Tommy, you have some nuance in here that I'd love to explore a little further with the overwhelmed individual versus somebody who's used to working with data. But in the realm of consumers, I my breakdown kind of starts with like the lay user. Like this is somebody who just looks at the page and knows nothing about
Yeah.
underneath,
Yep.
like not being negative, but it's typically like sales and marketing. Like their focuses are other and external, and they're the base level of
Right.
I understand what data is and how it moves through systems, et cetera. Then you have, I think, the Excel user or information worker, right? That is used to making business decisions. They Excel's their gig, and they may take that to a more advanced level, but it could be also somewhat rudimentary. And then I think, Mike, to your point, I think you have the analyst or the data worker, right, who has some of the capability to uh, understand how to query larger data sets, like pull their own information out of systems if they need to, et cetera. And then we move into kind of manager, director level, like mid-level management, and then executives. And I think as far as like audiences are concerned, those break down for me because there are large enough differences with how I would interact with them that would change the type of conversation I would have.
Agreed. And I think it also, I like the breakdown of those. I'm taking some notes here on this too. I'm thinking, the person who's used to consuming data, right? That the teams that are, I'm not the individual who will go out and build the report. I know what I want to see. I know what needs to be on the
Mhm.
report page, and I feel like those are individuals that are, we have different degrees of people of understanding of data, and I really like this idea that you talked about the information worker. That seems very comfortable to me because that person is, well, whether they're heavily SQL or more IT in nature, or they're heavily Excel, more maybe business side, front facing. I think I see the trend right now where a lot more information workers who have been traditionally Excel individuals are moving more towards SQL and learning these other languages. I teach some classes at the University of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and they have a whole class for continuing education around SQL. So there are SQL teams or information teams that are working on um, being able to grab that information and leverage it into actionable. I think it's a skill set that's becoming more common, right? It's becoming less of a this has to be learned in IT, and more people I think are becoming comfortable with learning that information.
Well, I kind of think we're missing a whole subset of people because we're talking about Excel, we're talking about SQL and people in that space. But I think the people that are requesting the reports usually, and I think the hardest one to kind of work with or collaborate is usually someone from either in a management role, leadership, someone who has kind of always been fed data now they have to transfer to a completely new way of looking at their numbers, so to speak. Before it might have been like a website, like a Salesforce, just a dashboard that they already had pre-configured. They didn't have to worry about it. If we go into that conversation where they're like, "Hey, we have Power BI, we need a report that does this," and you go into that going, "Okay, so let's define the business rules. What are we pulling from?" They have no idea what goes on the back end, and I think that's a majority. Oh, I don't want to say the majority, but a good amount of the people requesting reports may not have any idea like what the back end does.
And they
So
shouldn't
our
it shouldn't
no,
technically need to, right? That's why there is a team of people in the BI team to manage and own that for them. So I don't see them having a need to need to know how to, like, that's your job. I think the conversation for those individuals should be around, what do you need to see? What action, what decisions are you taking off of that action? You have to bring it up. So to your point, Tommy, right?
right.
There's people that understand the data path, the data lineage. There's people in that you're going to be asking requests for reports. And I think you're saying something slightly different, Tommy.
Yeah.
You're everything your world right now is, or I feel like you're speaking towards is, I'm getting tickets to ask for reports and or data. And I think Seth and I are approaching this from we're not getting tickets necessarily. It's more of we have data and we're talking with individuals about, hey, what reports do we need to make this thing successful? And maybe Seth, you are getting tickets, but I mean, most of my conversation is not ticket based at this point. Most of my conversation is, hey, I've got this huge pool of data. What do we do with it? And so I have to like sift through this really weird, nebulous cloud of like, here's a bunch of stuff. How do we help you out? And again, I know that's just very custom for what I do, because I'm coming into organizations and doing a lot of net new builds. You guys are in places where they're kind of established a little bit. You've already got Power BI there. There's already data kind of in your environment.
But even then, there's always going to be the disconnect of the business terminology and the understanding and what's actually in the database. And unfortunately, this happens more often than I would like. But it's the idea where there's a whole conversation happening in the department saying, we need to see our top accounts. And it's like, well, that's never been defined. So how are we going to define top accounts?
Well, that also I think is a different point. I think that what you're talking to there is what I would call maybe more of like the data maturity, right? If
Mhm.
someone, excuse me, if people at the higher levels are asking for, I need this kind of metric, and no one's defined what that means, there's not a common understanding of what that's different than, I think, the report pieces. That's just being able to understand what the requirement is.
But I guess even then, though, it's our job then to translate that technical back end
Yes.
and try to build that
Yeah,
data model.
100%.
Yeah.
So, and again, there are some people that as soon as you start talking about,
You don't talk about it. You don't need to. You can say I can do it or I can't do it. They don't need to understand all the details of all the tables and how the relationships work. You just need to understand what is the essence of their calculation and how do you validate that it's true or not.
I want to Tommy, continue on the path though. I want to hear like what your challenge is when you're engaging with those users right now. Like I want to hear that conversation. How does it
yes.
go?
So it's some requirement that's coming from their department and some initiative. We need to see our total number of books sold, right?
Sure.
And they're like, okay, yeah, we can build a report. So, and based on our corporate accounts. Okay, sure, great. So obviously the first part what we do is that in a sense configuration. Okay, so what's our scope? Is it this year, last year? And if you already, and I guess part of this too goes into our governance side, because if you really haven't defined what a book is or the pieces of content in an organization, it's going to be pretty hard to do this.
Yep.
And then it's basically like, okay, how do you want to, the question even like, how do you want to see the data? Right. So they're like, well, we just want to see the top accounts. Okay, we can do that. But if you avoid asking some of the questions on like, what are the insights? What features do you want? You can build a very static report that it probably doesn't do it justice, or you can try to begin to ask like, hey, do you need drill through? Well, if they, and if they've never heard a drill through, or they're overwhelmed, then they might not want, or they might not be thinking about all those advanced features that may actually help them in the report. Like,
Okay, I think I see where you're coming from a little bit.
yeah.
Yeah,
Keep going.
right.
So
Seth wants to hear more, so he can rip you apart.
I'm not golly. Wow, that's how you view me, huh, guys? No, keep going. It's just gonna kill me.
I'm
No,
setting
not
up.
at all.
I'm setting you up. But even those questions of, trying to, in a sense, define it down. Like, so our top accounts for this year, how do we want to view the data? They might not have any idea. You can either go one of two ways in this, and I think what happens is, again, walking on eggshells, is you can start building something and try to, in a sense, throw spaghetti on the wall, but then they will be overwhelmed even if you tell them, hey, this is something we're completely testing. This is just the sandbox. But that's already too much for them. The other side of that is you start going to, like, do you want to see it by country? What are the dimensions you want to see this by? How do you want to group it, or in a sense segment it? Even those types of questions, for someone, again, who may be used to a platform that, again, just shows them their dashboard, they don't have to think about, they might not know. Or if they do give you an answer, it might not be actually the best thing. So is trying to fish out or fetch out things that are actually going to be helpful for them, because, again, outside even a user just being overwhelmed, if they don't know the answers because they're, again, just used to something already being pre-populated, that report's not going to be useful for them. And I think that's kind of the biggest part of this that I started thinking about way too late last night, staying up. But we can build something and avoid someone being frustrated with the process, but that might not be a report that they're actually going to find useful, because it's not, it's just very static, so to speak. So I don't know if that makes sense, or if I went down a bit of a rabbit hole,
No,
but
it makes a lot of sense, right? But the there are some key things that you're saying that I think we hope to solve in this conversation around the fact that in an ideal state, the whole point of knowing your audience, or this topic in my mind, is so we don't get into a method of throwing spaghetti against the wall,
Yes,
right?
I agree with this.
And if I'm going to consolidate, the nugget that I'm initially looking at when I go across these groups, and why I broke them out the way I did, was because how I approach conversations with those folks, you could say in a term like, I dumb down my language, right? Or
Yep.
I break it all the way down
simplify it.
to a point where I'm not intimidating the end user with the words I'm using. And I am consistently working with my team to on this, because the minute you start talking about the technical things of, or structures that we're used to in the background, especially with Power BI, models, dimensions, filter context,
These are unknown.
measure,
Yep.
that, like,
yeah.
you say one of these things to the lay user and they freak out, and they'll instantly turn off and be like, what is Tommy saying? I don't, and realistically, all you as a report author are trying to do is convey something
Yep.
that you're used to using in your normal everyday language,
Yeah.
that you can't use with those audience people. And I guess
I was gonna
if
say,
I'm gonna, yeah, go ahead.
I was gonna say, this is why my wife says the podcast is like totally boring to her, because we use words. She's like, I don't even know what these things are defined as. She knows I say the word Power BI, data models. She'll randomly throw out words like data lake. How's the data lake today? Like like those kind of things, because she hears me say these buzzwords but doesn't really understand context of, like, she doesn't use them every day. She doesn't understand like what's going on there. But to your point, Seth, I mean, I want to reiterate your point. People don't understand the lingo that we use inside our program. They understand calculations and sums and aggregations. So we have to like change how we talk a little bit there.
And so to take this a step further, right? So, like, depending on these levels, Tommy, right? It is fundamental that we know the definitions of things, right?
Yeah.
So if they're saying, I want to know the total number of books sold, as you're going through this process of engaging with the audience, like having that definition and walking through, like, hey, so when you say the number of books, are we talking about, this thing, and this is, what you're recommending, or is it, this, right? Because you're thinking, like, we're in a unique position more often than not, because we know the source systems, we know how that data is stored, we know what's capable
Yeah.
in terms of being a metric that we can pull forward, and we're the liaison between that raw storage of data in some frame and what the business needs are. And there, a lot of times there's a layer of, like, we have to transform the data in a certain way or group it together or whatnot. But that initial framework of, like, let's make sure we're on the same page of, like, the metrics you want in your report is a great starting point. But I think the one point I stress, and maybe we talked a bit about audience in, our process podcast a while ago, is the most important thing to me when you're talking to any audience is empathy. Have those people give you a picture of a day in the life of me, the information worker, and why this report is useful to me, and what are the decisions I'm going to be making based on the information that you provide to me. And in some cases, like the information worker, that might be the easiest report, because it's like, well, we need to see the raw data of all the sales records, dump it out in a paginated report, right? Like,
Right.
because we need to see all of these granular pieces of data. I don't need anything fancy. The reason we're doing this is because our group does blah 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 blah, right? Versus um, an analyst or data worker or manager, where you're having to pre-aggregate a bunch of stuff, and they're like, well, in my day-to-day job, I run through this massive Excel process, and then I, transform the data, and I group it by this, and I do all these things, and those are the fun ones, because you have a really large opportunities to streamline business process and just give them the single metric. Like, you wanted to know this thing, and this is what you're making your decision off of, and that's what's the key importance. And when you put yourself in their position, that also can drive, like, how they're going to utilize the report page, and kind of key you into what are the dimensions they want, what are the slicers, what are the filters, what are the things that they're going to, easily parse their data or want to sink down by, and give you a lot of keys to answer the questions that you're describing, which is, I want to build something useful. I don't want to throw spaghetti against the wall. I don't want to frustrate
Right.
my end user. And if we start with putting ourselves in their position, they may not be able to answer. And typically, I think a bad question is, how do you want to see the data? We're like, I don't know, man. Like, like
I do I do think there's like a little bit of like you there's an area of give them what they want, and then take what their needs are, to Seth's point,
Right.
interpret what what you hear them saying, right? Because they're gonna say they're gonna get like most of the story right about what they want. So hey, I want to see the list of the top 10 customers. Great. Give them a little short list of here's the top 10, right? But in your mind, you're thinking, well, actually, if I take the top 10, well, I might want to also see the bottom 10. So maybe I should show them like a side by side. Here's the top 10, here's the bottom 10. Or and then you think, okay, in your mind, you take their analytic and you look a little bit beyond it. Okay, well, the top selling customers really isn't important to me, right? It's the top customers that changed the most, right? What was the percent change over a period of time, this year versus last year, something like that, right? Which are the top gainers, which are the top losers, right? And you kind of take their requirement and give a little bit of extra. You don't have to always give it to them in the meeting initially, but then you come back and say, okay, here's what you wanted. Here's the top 10. I made another page here with some other examples of some visuals that you may want that may help you with your analysis here. Here's the top 10. Here's the bottom 10. Here's the top most improved customers based on percentage or volume. Here's the ones that reduced the most of volume. So maybe you give them a couple extra options, right? Because I think we only know what we know, right? We haven't been exposed to all the different situations where we need to build insights and visuals as we have. So it's our job to kind of bring to them their initial idea, but then also enhance it with a couple other visuals that maybe make sense to them. I don't know, thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I think the biggest thing in terms of trying to find success across the spectrum of the different audiences is something that you've done, Mike, or you've talked about, but is starting from something where people aren't thinking about data or a report, so to speak. I actually just tried this out on a few different team calls to talk about the next year, and this was basically a group of anywhere from 10 to 20 people on the call, all talking about what they wanted to see for reporting for 2022. So obviously that's a pretty big bounce, a pretty big take. And there are people there who view Power BI all the time. There are people who are like, I sometimes use it.
Mm-hmm.
So it's instead of and I think I used to have the problem of trying to translate everything into a report. Like, okay, what kind of report do you want? You want analytical, etc. So one of the questions that I start off with is let's take a back seat from talking about data, reports, features, all that stuff. Is that ideal state? And very specific question that I asked that so far I've seen it receive across the different audiences, but is let's say in a year from now, we had $1 million for just your team, and your team couldn't be happier with, like what Power BI or what report you have. Like we're high fiving. Why would that be? Kind of thing. And just taking that ideal state, so because they might not know necessarily what's possible, and they're not going to say, "Oh, because I have a bar chart." Usually, they're actually going to go into, "Okay, what would be something successful for me? Why would I be happy with, a year from now?" It's, "Oh, well, I would be able to see my customers this way." So they're not talking about it from a report, kind of like a reporting spectrum, because I think a lot of times people go, okay, I'm meeting with the BI team, so I have to talk about data and visualizations. No, when people coming to us is if you're trying to see, what can we float to the top, what can we help you do? So th- let's get out of that box, or let's get out of that bubble of just visuals and talk about a year from now we are successful. Why? Because we built everything you did, and just getting people to begin to talk. And then for us as the creators, then we can begin to understand, okay, I can see what that means, and obviously writing it down. But I find it funny because we've done these types of calls where we're saying, imagine you had 10 BI people that were working on your reports for a whole year,
Yeah,
and
you're
there's a
basically saying no holes
yeah,
barred. Give me the ideal solution, so you can start
right,
teasing out like what do we have? Where's are the gaps in our current solution? Right? You're trying to say
right.
in an ideal state, give me some. Well, yeah. Do you do anything around Tommy? Like it sounds like a brainstorm session though to me.
Yeah, but I think it's just how you frame it, because you could say, "Show me the insights," but and I know that you've done that too, but I think even the word insights, right? So when you say like,
Well,
"Oh,
I'll,
I
I'll
want
also
to,"
I'll explain it like this. Tell me what you need to see so you can take action. That's another way I'll describe it, and I think that also resonates really well. Like and what I'll do is when people ask me or we draw up on a whiteboard or we draw on a table or I'll do whiteboarding a lot with people, and then we'll just doodle on things and figure out like, hey, this is what we think we're going to be building. And then what I'll do is I'll question back to them is like, what action do you take off of this chart? What action do you take off of this? Because I
Mhm.
kick the that part back to them, and when I do that, I think it really helps people think about, well, that's not really important, right? I have this really large, like my action is export it to Excel and do some other analysis. Well, okay, then we're not there yet, right? We haven't got the right amount of data to this table to do your analysis here.
I want to draw into this conversation though. One of the things that might be creating challenges for Tommy, for you, or many people when we have these conversations. If you, I have a tendency, and I call myself a conversation killer, because as a meeting is occurring or after, as we're talking about a topic, I will formulate a bunch of thoughts around this broad spectrum of a topic. And when I start, providing my insight or, my opinion, whatever, I'll cover so much ground that by the end of it,
No
there's
one's
not much to say.
say.
Like how does somebody come back with like interjecting at what point they want to discuss something further, right? And I think we tend to do that in our initial conversations because if we're talking to an audience that wants a report or needs a report and we're saying what is the end state of this thing and they don't know,
Right.
I don't know, maybe the focus is let's make sure we do bite-sized chunks here. Let's focus on the immediate problem. Let's solve the problem that you have and ask these questions. And to Mike's point earlier, right? Like if we view all of these things as iterative,
Mhm.
what is the immediate problem we're trying to solve? What is the business problem we're trying to solve? And what is the best way for us to solve that? And we have this translation of like what they need, and it's our job to translate how they're saying things into visuals that might be helpful for them, like over time, or are we going to use a bar chart? Are we going to use a line graph? Are we going to just give them a table? Like we should be doing that on our own, and then outline for them what that first looks like. And maybe the first pass is, hey, this report solves this problem for you, right? And you give them a baseline of, even if this is whiteboard, right?
Mhm.
You're iteratively walking this page. Well, watch. I think if we did this and then we added this, like this would allow you to do these things and just describe the interaction of the page. Then they're with you, right? Then they have in their mind's eye, like, oh, okay, like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Let's talk about like how these things would work on the page, what information would be shown. Now I'm with you, Tommy. And whether it's in that first conversation to take it to the next step right away
Right.
is dependent, I think, on group. But then you can be like, okay, so if this is the baseline and we're answering your problem right away with this information, off the top of my head, for future iteration, we could do something like this. Or here's the insight we could provide because Power BI has this mechanism that you can right click on this row and then we could show you like the history of this book sale over the last 6 months because I'm hearing you keep saying that a lot. That's important to understand on a book by book level, you know, how that performance has been. And this is a really easy way for us to provide that information to you. And you just described drill through without saying drill through,
Right.
right? How many other things do we know as professionals in, Power BI or, business intelligence that would enhance a solution that we've already brought them to that first framework of and saying, hey, here's what you get. Like you're good to go. Now we can talk about these other things, and I'll do that in a different levels to kind of maybe iterate on the report that they want.
Are you guys watching the YouTube chat at all by chance?
Too busy talking, man.
I know you guys are talking. So there is some amazing comments. I just want to pay a little bit of comment. What you're saying right there, I think dovetails very well on what people are chatting about in the chat window here. Mark says, in his meetings, he intends to go with this question. We've talked about like what are these? Define the insight, right? So maybe saying the words define the insight. People won't know what that means. And then I communicated, hey, what does it mean to take action on this, or how does this chart drive for action? Is how I would say it. And then Mark says, what is the argument you want to win? I really liked that statement
Mm.
because as I think about it, and this is going to be Tommy for the philosophical side of things, right? All these reports, everything we're doing, we're trying to make data-based decisions. So we're either going to go left or we're going to go right based on some information, right? Do we increase the marketing budget or do we decrease the marketing budget? Do we hire more people or do we reduce size in our company because of not enough sales, right? There's decision points. We're trying to argue a point one way or the other, and we're trying to use the data to decide the outcome of that argument or make an educated decision. This makes a lot of sense to me. Talk to me about what kind of arguments are we trying to resolve here with this information? And this is where my engineering background comes into this. I love this whole idea of like propose a hypothesis, find data to support it, and if either it says it's true or not. So I love that scientific kind of experience around using data to make decisions, because it fits very well with that. I think we should spend more marketing budget because of why, right? And then I go look at the data and say, oh yeah, every time we spend another $10,000, we're able to get another $50,000 in sales. Yeah, let's try another experiment of, I have a hypothesis, if we spend more in marketing, we're going to get more in sales. You do that, and then you come back to the data after the fact and say, okay, we spent the additional money. How much more return in sales did we get? Did we hit a diminishing returns? Anyways, I thought that was a really good point there. There's a lot of other great talk around how to handle these scenarios inside organizations.
And I think we're all trying to say, I think even regardless to the technical user who knows the data and they want to start building their own reports, to someone who is still overwhelmed by a bar chart. If they click on when they click on a data point,
Yep.
everything filters, they have no idea why. I think the biggest thing is, I think, framing it that way, where you can get into the report and the features, the features that you want in the report later, but understanding why this would be useful, like what are those success points? Why
Yes.
is this a win? And again, it's what are you using this for, or not even what are you using this report for, but like what is going to be the point of this, and being able to have that discussion before you even start building
Yeah.
is one, I think, also empowers the users too.
Yeah.
So
Totally agree.
And one thing, like I might be nitpicking on a word you're saying, Tommy, but when having these conversations, we should never be talking about features. Like
yeah,
if you're asking the question, what feature do you want in your report? That's the wrong thing to ask any audience.
Well,
Like I think in these conversations, like you set a stage, and then I would argue the vast majority of end consumers are used to seeing current state things, like
yes.
show me like the top this,
Yep.
show me that,
Yep.
and and starting with the baseline of, okay, I understand, like here's what you need to see, here's what you can do, right? Like here's my other thoughts around the data and what you're telling me is important, and this is why it's really important to, like, I call it empathy, but it's a use case, understanding their use case. Is you can then elevate the solution by saying, well, in Mike's case, well, you're asking for the top 10 book sales, but if we also show you the bottom sales, like, isn't that helpful from a, like, where you want to improve, um improve on sales in your worst performing? And then it elicits the conversation, well, yeah, that's relevant, but this metric of, volume is really important for us, because we don't care about just the lowest sales. It would
Hmm.
be impacted by volume. And you
Yeah.
could say, yeah, that's actually a really good point, so we'll build that into your lowest performing, but higher volume segmented thing, and you'll blow their mind. They're like, you can do that?
Yep.
Yes, we can do that, right? And
Yeah.
then, like, through those conversations of solving more business problems, you're introducing more higher level techniques of introducing new features within Power BI, of, just leveraging this lexicon of all of the capabilities we have, but you're doing that in the lens of solving the additional harder business problems that people, I think, in large part, are completely unaware of.
Man, there's so there's so many. I thought this was going to be kind of a wash of a. Every time we do this one, we've hit the mark, right? We've gotten over the 30-minute mark, and there is a lot of rich conversation happening, and this is like really good stuff. I really like this, moving away from the tech. Like, we're your comment there, Seth, made me think around, like, we're weaving a data story, and what we're trying to do is we're trying to help the end user fabricate what their data story is looking like. I like that. I do think
Yeah.
another point I wanted to make here was, there are different types of reports for different types of users. And I've had an
Yeah.
engaging talk on this before, where we talk about kind of like, at the executive VP, maybe even director level, you don't give a lot of features. It's basically, I need to show up, look at a page, and know what I need to do. we're looking to make things go up or down, red or green. It's kind of like a single pane of glass. I'm not expecting users to really like use all the Power BI features. Now, there may be, this is a very broad generalization, but there are users at that top level that really do want to dive into data, go to see the details of things, really be able to go into the information. And I've seen people like that, so that it does happen. But from a know your audience standpoint, my my general feeling is when we get to those executive level leaders, it's got to be simple. It's got to look good. It's got to be clear. There's only a couple things that I'm interested in. And I'm going to wake up in the morning, or I'm going to go at my computer. I'm going to glance at a couple pages. Boom, boom, boom. Yeah, looks good. Move on. And so when we start talking about other individuals like the information worker or the analyst, they're much more comfortable with having a lot more visuals on the page, right? Um, and I'm going to go back to that executive level person, right? A lot of things are like, do I need to take action on stuff? Show me red or greens. Sales are good. Sales are not good. We're on track. We're not on track. We're meeting our goals. We're not meeting our goals. It needs to be kind of like polarizing kind of thing so that they can make a decision on it. So they can say, okay, we need to stop doing whatever we were doing and focus on X, Y, Z, or figure out why we lost these large accounts. We need to do some investigation on that so we can retain the amount of sales or goals we have for the company.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Like, if you rearrange like in order the I guess the easiest group to interact with versus the hardest, I think it goes like um the analyst or data worker, because they understand the data structures and you can use a lot of the same vernacular that you
Yep.
normally do. Like, right, they get how you would go build things out, and it's just an easy conversation.
Yep.
Then information worker, then you go into managers or
Yep.
mid-level management.
Yep.
Sales, I think, is challenging because a lot of the times they do need some harder calculations or higher level things, but don't have any understanding of the data. And then I think the hardest is executive, because those are the metrics that need to be well defined and are big roll ups and KPIs
Yes.
more often than not, that have a lot of business logic underneath the covers that
Yep.
has to be all in line. and and you have to do a lot of piecing of things together, on the back end in a very technical nature to produce that single thing
Yeah.
for them that they are tracking.
I was just describing this exact same thing in my business. So I'm the owner of the business, right? I look at different metrics at a much higher level than everyone else
Yeah.
does in the company. So the managers of people look at something different than the workers of the people, right? So if again from a consulting perspective, right, the worker, the person doing the executing out the work, they're focused on what tasks do I have, how many hours have I consumed to make sure I'm meeting my goals. The manager level is worried about his level of hours and everyone underneath of them, that they're managing their hours to the right degree. Me, I'm worried about everything. I'm worried about the money coming in. I'm worried about the money going out. I'm worried about the hours for every single person across the entire company. And so for me, I need much more aggregated, quick looks at dashboards. I don't have a lot of time to really drive into that. And so I think the further up you go, you have to do a better job of simplifying and making the story clearer the higher up the organization that you go.
Um,
That's just a very broad generalization that I've got there. And Dan Meisner is like
So
hot
yeah,
on the
he's
chat, man.
ripping this one up today.
He's chatting
I
some good stuff in there.
before we wrap up, I wanna go back 20 minutes to a segue real quick, because it's an encouragement thing. You were talking about how you're seeing a lot of information workers going into this class where they're learning SQL and
Yeah,
engaging in larger data sets. And
I think so.
what I would like to do is just encourage the audience, if that is your position, like if you're an information worker, you're a heavy Excel person.
Hmm.
I've been reading or listening to this book called Deep Work by Cal Newport recently, and we've talked at length, even within the last 5 years, of how fast data sizes are growing within organizations, and the amount of information organizations can consume and store at a reasonable cost, right?
Yeah,
And the it is extremely important for the general information worker to start to build into their um, repertoire of skills, a language or something that allows them to query large sets of data, because it's not going to, like, in order to continue to provide value to an organization, like, you're gonna need at in very short
Hmm.
period of time here the ability to query or understand how to access and generate these data sets, because they're not going to be able to be exported in Excel and you rip it apart from there.
Yeah.
You're going to need to go pull the information out of a much larger data set,
Aggregate it
and
to
that
see the
doesn't,
aggregations.
right, it
Yeah.
doesn't mean you need to be a rock star,
Nope.
but
Yep.
like, you will definitely need his point in there, and I agree with, is you definitely need to build some set of skills where you're comfortable extracting and filtering, pre-filtering data sets before, to analyze and work with. And that's why Power BI is just a fantastic
Oh,
tool
it's
as far as
crushing it.
that engages, right?
Yeah.
It allows us to do that to the lay user, but there's that in between layer where people who are dealing with data on a large basis, highly encourage them to look into the market and figure out, maybe it's Python, maybe it's SQL,
But I'm gonna lean on this though, Seth. I mean, you know it. I know it. We've had people tell us it's not. SQL runs the world. The SQL language, whether you're not
they're
whether
yeah,
you're in
they're
Oracle, whether you're in Databricks, when you're in big data, doesn't matter where you are. If you don't know SQL, you're not going to be able to do well with data. And everything that I see is wherever SQL is being put in place, people like that kind of experience. It's yes, it's you have to learn it. It's definitely a learning curve to get going there, but
yeah.
it's being placed everywhere you think of. And I'm even thinking about like Power Query and query folding, right? Power Query, even though it's a GUI, it's a user interface that's visual, it still writes SQL on the back end to query fold things back into the source systems. So I think about this going, wow, this is SQL is becoming, for me, it's very universal for what I do my work with. And I think that's a super strong point. And I would highly recommend taking some time, learning some deeper things about SQL. And also see if I can dig up that UWM SQL class, because I've heard good things from it. See if I can get that link here in the chat window here. I've got it here. So it's a just a general introduction class. It's an all online class, I believe, where you walk through and start learning some basics of SQL. Tommy, you've been very quiet. Did we just steam you? Did we just roll you over, Tommy? As we just steam you?
This is one of those I'm probably going to be thinking about for quite a bit. Oh, man.
Just deep in thought.
I don't know, man. This is one of those that, as you continue to kind of work on the communication skills, you work on, I think a lot of things we said too, is the experience that you have, your ability to actually talk like the business.
Yes.
And then I think at the end of the day, it's always funny where I remember Seth from a previous episode was saying where they're like, all I would love is if there's a pie chart and you did it like in real time. And a lot of the things that we can do for people, if we know what they are looking for, it's almost too easy. But it's almost harder to really get those requirements exactly what they want. So it's a report that's not a one and done. That is something that they can actually go back to and view. So
I want to, that's a good point, Tommy. And you had a question here earlier, and I wanted to kind of tease out my thoughts on how this question was posed and talk through the insight here. So one of the items here was, I think one of the insights you were looking for, going back to talking about the book sales, right? What are the distributions of book sales for my corporate accounts? When I hear that kind of question, other things I would be thinking about is, do you want to only see this for corporate accounts? Or would you want to see this for corporate accounts and other types of accounts? The answer is, again, I'm interpreting here. The answer is probably yes, but also depending on what the data is doing, the corporate accounts probably are the largest sellers or largest consumers of those products. So, maybe you need, like in this case, maybe you just say, I'll just show you the distribution of book sales and give you a slicer for different types of accounts. So you can go in and look at corporate or personal or whatever other account types you have in there, educational, whatever that may be. You'd have different distributions, and you could look at it. I try and add, like, you asked for this little insight, but that's a very small window of the whole world of data that we have. I try and give them options to say, here's a filter that lets you see this data in a specific way.
Well, I don't know if there's a blog post or a template here, but
There's definitely some kind of
loving
like
it.
checklist. I think there's a lot of I've taken a lot of good notes. I think so for me, some of the key takeaways here for me are kind of around, I think Seth's comments around simplifying the tool into easy to consume, understandable terms is going to be pivotal the higher up you go in an organization, right? I'm not going to talk about drill through. I'm not going to talk about specific features of Power BI. I'm going to say, do you want to see the details? I'm going to focus on the story of the data and driving for that action thing. And that's one I think that would be a good implementer for me out of this one. Anything for you, Seth, as a final wrap-up thought?
Yeah, I agree with that. You know, hone.
What Mike said.
I agree with myself. I agree with myself.
You better.
I think the best thing we could do is, as we've been wrapping up, I've been thinking about it. I think it's important. We're in a unique spot, like, because we have a foot in engineering and we have a foot in the business, and a lot of people who know Power BI are, you know, from the business or whatnot, right? But you understand both of these worlds, and if you don't, the best thing you can do is hone your skills in framing how you communicate with the business, regardless, because any one of these groups, if you don't use the technical jargon, you're going to be much more effective in getting to the heart of what they want and need. And it's not necessarily like the want part. It's, let's frame everything in the context of what problems we're solving, what are the really key important metrics, how are you going to engage with it on a daily basis, and what decisions are you making, and then move on from there, right? And
I like that.
And do it in digestible ways. Yeah.
Tommy, any kind of final thoughts, wrap-ups for you?
Honestly, I think the biggest thing is try to understand the way people are. Like, I think one of the best things that my boss told me a while back that I really stayed true is try to understand what someone's going to ask before they ask it.
Don't ask
And
questions
then
you don't know the answer to.
Well, yeah. So sure.
Like that.
No, ask all the
questions.
I'd say the reverse of that. Ask all the questions you don't know the answers to, because that's the only way you're going to be able to understand whether or not, you know, you're on.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, I think with that, we've kind of wrapped up a full hour of randoming. Dan says it best. He goes, man, I look at your topics and think, how the heck are we going to fill 30 minutes with this dumb topic? And then here we are, 8:30 rolls right past, and we are filled up a full hour. So great topic, good discussion. I really appreciate you guys. Gave me lots of food for thought here. Our only ask, if you love the podcast or don't love the podcast, or, you know, think it stinks, you're more than welcome. Please just share it with somebody else. We appreciate the word of mouth. Let someone else know that you found some value from it, and let somebody else know that you found this either entertaining and or was able to gain some knowledge around Power BI. Tommy, where can you find the podcast?
You're going to find the podcast anywhere they're available on Apple and Spotify. Make sure to subscribe, and you can view all of our previous episodes. Episodes come out every Tuesday and Thursday. If you want to join the conversation live, you can do so. Just subscribe to Power BI Tips on YouTube and LinkedIn.
Awesome. Well, thank you all very much. Appreciate it. And we'll see you next week on Tuesday.